Hello, everyone. I'm Paris Fox, and I'd like to welcome you to 12 O'Clock High, a podcast on business leadership with Tom Fox, hosted by Richard Lummis.
What makes a great leader? Is it genetic, or can you learn leadership skills? Join Tom Fox and Richard Lummis in this podcast, where they consider leadership from a wide variety of perspectives: academic, behavioral science, history, popular culture, the movies, and much more. You'll learn about specific tactics and strategies that you can bring to your own leadership toolkit. 12 O'Clock High is a production of the Compliance Podcast Network.
Hello, and welcome to another episode of 12 O'Clock High, a podcast about leadership. This is Richard Lummis. I'm here with Tom Fox for another discussion on how to improve our leadership skills. We believe leadership is a skill which can be improved with study of both good and bad practices, and we try to draw interesting examples from many sources, including history, fiction, film, and business writing. Welcome back, Tom.
Thank you, Richard.
Today we're going to do sort of a wrap-up of what we've discussed in 2019, and we've kind of been all over the map, I think, this last year looking at the podcasts. What was your most fun podcast, Tom?
Well, we had just several different, and it's hard to say which of your children is your favorite, but I enjoyed.
Depends on the day.
Depends on the day. We did multiple series this year, and I think that was fun to look at things in a longer story arc. We started off with, although we posted it at the end of right at the end of 2018, was a series on General Stanley McChrystal, retired General Stanley McChrystal's book on leadership. And he took a look at a wide variety of leaders, and we took a sort of a deep dive into each one of those. The MacArthur-Truman series was a lot of fun, kind of revisiting their very different leadership styles, and then the inevitable, I think, confrontation, which led to Truman sacking MacArthur. Probably for the most fun in terms of researching a podcast series was the economic bubbles and financial crises that we did a little bit earlier this year, where we took a look at literally economic bubbles from the 1600s up to the early 1900s, and discussed what led to them and what the fallout was, and some leadership lessons from each one of those. Always have fun with our Oscar series. We had fun again with that this year. We've continued to explore leaderships from each of the American presidents, and this year we focused on the post-Civil War presidents up until we have not yet gotten to Teddy Roosevelt. And the thing that really struck me there, Richard, was there are no new issues in American politics. The immigration issue, the debt issue, Treasury issues that are still debated today were equally and as vociferously debated in the 1860s, 1870s, and 1880s as they are in 2019. And I really enjoyed our lead up to the Civil War because we saw sort of the dynamic and a road leading to true Armageddon. But it really struck me that particularly after Reconstruction ended, how many of the issues that we still struggle with today, we were struggling with, I guess that's 130 or 140 years ago. But probably the most fun, I would have to say, and my favorite was when we did a tribute to Philip Kerr in his final novel, Bernie Gunther novel. I really felt like I was kind of saying goodbye to an old friend and saying goodbye to an author, saying goodbye to a character. But also, it didn't strike me, I think, till we were in the podcast, that maybe we were saying goodbye to a city. Because the city of Berlin really was as big a character in all of the Bernie Gunther novels as Bernie was. And that this is Weimar, Berlin, so there was a definite end to that character's life. And that was perhaps a little bit less leadership and more personal fun for both of us. But those were some of the highlights for me. How about from your end?
Well, one of the things about the presidential series that struck me was how little I knew about them. I've taken a fair number of history classes, but I don't think we've ever covered that particular time period in depth. It's just one of those things that gets skipped over. You jump from Civil War to World War I, or certainly Teddy Roosevelt and the jingoist era. But you're right, and then reading the biographies of those people, the problems they were facing are all too familiar today. MacArthur Truman, I loved that one. The reading for it is a little voluminous, but still worth doing. And it was interesting to see how polarizing the two figures still are today to the people who study them. I always love our Oscar series, and yeah, I'm going to miss the Philip Kerr.
So I guess that you bring up a good point on the polarization of American politics. Certainly, that is a topic of comment now, but we've always had polarization. And you're absolutely right. Probably as much a moment of polarization was the sacking of MacArthur by Truman. Truman at that point probably, I believe, had the lowest presidential rating of any U.S. president. He did not stand for re-election, although he could have. If he had stood for re-election, I think he would have been decimated.
Yes.
Going forward. But I think history recorded it was probably the right decision because if the United States had bombed mainland China, I'm pretty sure we would have been engaged in a much wider mainland Asia war than the Korean Peninsula.
I agree, and I think you made the right choice. But one of the things, I didn't live through the period, but just the visceral hatred of Truman on the part of the Republicans. Okay, you got to switch the parties today, but it's nothing new in American politics, and the same with the 19th century presidents we saw. There were some very harsh words exchanged.
Very harsh words indeed. The McChrystal book, I would highly recommend that to anyone who enjoys, one, a great read, two, leadership, three, thoughts from one of our top former, now retired generals, and really a different way to look at leadership, certainly through the structure of military eyes, but also through eyes of innovation, through eyes of people who utilized PR, and a wide variety of characters that we perhaps don't think about as leadership. And whereas I think Walt Disney might be someone we would think of in terms of innovation, perhaps not leadership, and certainly not Coco Chanel.
Yeah, yeah. But I guess that's partly just the blinkered focus that we tend to have, and the emphasis on politics and business. So.
Well, I can't wait to see what the next decade may bring us, Richard.
I'm actually looking forward to it too, and I also recommend reading up on I particularly enjoyed the Mississippi Bubble.
Yes.
But I also knew very little about the Panic of 1907, and that's also a fascinating one, and probably has more relevance to the modern economy.
Let me disagree with you on that because I think it was actually the Mississippi Bubble that had the greatest relevance. John Knox was someone.
John Law.
John Law was not someone I had any experience in. I knew the name, but I had no appreciation of a 17th century or 18th century Englishman being a pre or proto-Keynesian and what he was trying to do in the context of an absolute monarchy with an economy controlled by the king and the king's ministers. And I found that absolutely fascinating. It was not the bubble of the South Sea bubble or the tulip bubble, but nevertheless a severe economic crash. But it, I thought, really presaged many of the questions that economists still struggle with today.
Well, it did, and the economies were smaller, and the governments certainly had less control over them. Well, I guess that's not strictly true. The absolutist kings of France had a fair amount of control. They just handled it very ineptly.
Right. And then in the Panic of 1907, I was certainly aware of the story of J.P. Morgan and his rescue. What I was really not as aware of was he was able to pull it off, not simply because he had financial resources he could bring to bear, but because of integrity and people's trust in him. And that when he was able to put people in a room and either demand or ask of them to do something, and they trusted him enough to follow his lead.
Yeah. I'd like to see some more of that in the modern world, but
Not holding your breath?
not holding my breath. Is there anything in particular we should talk about in the next year?
That's a great point, Richard. Perhaps we ought to go back and maybe look at some academics. We did that early on in this podcast series, and we haven't done that in a while. I'm really enjoying these sort of thematic series we're doing, and so I might figure out a way to see if there are other examples of perhaps a nuts and bolts toolkit approach to one or two podcasts. We've got February is our month of Oscars, so we'll have to pick some fun movies to look at there. And I'm fairly certain that the business world will provide us with some stories to talk about in the context of leadership.
I'm sure it will. Now, I do have one book. I have two books actually on my nightstand that I think we'll probably get around to. One is on appeasement and the run up to World War II. And I think if you talk about a failure of leadership, I think that's something we need to talk about. And the other one is The Anarchy, about the history of the East India Company, and which also involves an early impeachment, although it was in Parliament rather than the U.S. Congress.
Might we need to bookend the appeasement book with sort of Churchill's first month?
Yeah, absolutely.
That might be a good series, good little part series.
So a little teaser for you. You can look for something in the next year.
So, Richard, I guess the thing I would like to end with is I recently had to kind of write a summary of this podcast for someone, and I was struck again by the name. And, we chose 12 O'Clock High for a reason because of the movie that we both enjoyed. But in kind of thinking back to that movie, the more I am struck by the true business leadership lessons from that movie, and thinking about my first experience of seeing it as a war movie, as a more mature adult seeing it as a business process movie, although in the context of obviously World War II, and how leadership can the tactics, techniques, and strategies of leadership, I think, can be taught and they can be communicated, because World War II was not fought by West Point trained generals. It was fought by people like our parents. And so the leadership skills they brought to bear in the armed services were things that they had learned or they knew, and those same leadership skills they brought back into the civilian world that they used after the war. So I was just struck by having selected this title and based it on this movie and how much leadership there was in that movie.
Yeah. I should go back and rewatch it because I enjoy it every time. For now, this is Tom Fox and Richard Lummis with 12 O'Clock High. We hope you'll listen in all next year.
This is Paris Fox again. We hope you enjoyed this episode of 12 O'Clock High, a podcast on business leadership with Tom Fox. If you enjoyed the show, please go to iTunes and rate the podcast. Thank you for listening.